All right, we're back, and now we're going to talk about the role of culture on our outcomes. So first off, let's define culture. I grabbed this out of the dictionary: the enduring behaviors, ideas, attitudes, and traditions shared by a large group of people and transmitted from one generation to the next. On my last video, I signed off saying that, we're going to start with our family culture, because our families do have cultures. There are certain expectations, attitudes, ideas, shared by a large group of people, and that could be, you and your nuclear family, up to including your extended family being, grandparents or cousins or aunts and uncles, or if you start sort of spinning it out, you can end up with a pretty decently large group of people. But I would like to argue that, 3 or more is going to qualify as a group, that has enduring exposure to each other. They're going to have influences on each other's behaviors and attitudes and ideas. And so there's always that little family culture, and then it broadens out. This is what we really mean a lot of the times when we talk in psychology about environment. We're not usually talking about whether you live in a desert or a forest, right? We are usually talking about the culture in which you're being raised, in your household, in your town, in your region, in your country, like that. That serves as environment for you. So, knowing that culture is going to have an impact on us, how does the culture interact with our genes? Like, is that even possible? A lot of us think about genes as being sort of like a blueprint or a set of directions, and they have been written down and they have to be, followed. It's just, that's what they are. They're on-off switches. Well, it turns out that as we're studying more and more about genes, alleles, things like that, the evidence is becoming quite clear that your genes are not static. They don't just turn on and off, and that it is what it is. They interact with your environment. So here, let me give you a really simple example. Shortened daylight triggers animals to change their fur color or to go into hibernation. That is what we call a gene-environment interaction. The genes are there for, let's say, the little Martin, little cute weaselly guy, who spends his, spring, summer, fall with brown fur to turn into white fur because he lives in a snowy area, right? And it's the daylight that warns him, okay, it's getting ready to get snowy. He doesn't know otherwise. It's the daylight, right? If he lived someplace where the daylight was consistent, let's say we kept him in a zoo and it was always, we had UV lights that we could keep on him, he would keep his fur whatever color we wanted. We could give him short days, or we could give him long days, and he would have brown, or he would have white fur based on the genes' responses to the environment. Another great example for you as a human is that you have genes that try to protect your deeper skin cell levels from damage by the creation of a blister when there's friction. Like, that's a protective strategy to keep you from really harming the deeper layers. So you have this predisposition, this ability to make blisters, but only in the correct context. Like, you could spend your whole life never getting a blister if you didn't ever face the kind of friction it would take to make a blister. So there are lots of examples of very much biologically that illustrate this point, that the gene and the environment interact with each other. So you can imagine, for sure, behaviorally, that's got to be true. I mean, we already acknowledge how changeable our behaviors are. So if you have a predisposition to behave in a certain way, that doesn't mean you have to behave that way. You are going to be influenced by your environment. And then I'd also like to throw in, as a good cognitive psychologist, I'm going to mention also you have higher order thinking that you can impose on your behaviors. And so while you might have a predisposition to behave in a particular way, because that's sort of like the genetic reflex way that you would act, like, for example, when you get startled, you actually display the prey response, where you freeze for a second. And no matter how much you would rather be running at the moment, you're kind of frozen for a second before you can act, unless you have had lots of experiences in this situation where now you have, this plan of action that you can engage in. If it's if it's a startle, for sure, you're going to freeze like a prey animal. It's this old antiquated way to protect, because, predators can't see you very well if you hold still. So you kind of freeze and then you get reactivated. That's a good example of how your genes have this natural way for you to act. And the environment can elicit that natural response from you. And then you can kind of derail that natural response through practice or cognition or something like that. The field of epigenetics studies how your actual genes may actually get changed by your environmental experience. So, for example, if you are an overweight adult prior to having children, you may have actually altered your genetic profile such that your offspring will inherit a tendency towards obesity themselves. Now, when I was a student back in the dark ages of the 20th century, they didn't really think this was true. Like this epigenetics really started to come around in about the 1990s and into the 00s, and people were still contesting it really hard. But when I was a student, they laughed at this kind of idea as Lamarckian. Some of you might be familiar with Lamarck from your biology studies, who argued that the giraffe has a long neck because each generation stretched farther and stretched farther and stretched farther to reach the leaves, and so each subsequent generation inherited a slightly longer neck. And we kind of laughed at poor simple Lamarck. Obviously, you can't pass things like that on to your offspring, except for that you kind of can. Certain genes seem to be mutable and can be passed on to your offspring in that mutable way. So that's that whole burgeoning new area called epigenetics. So let's imagine you have your genes, and there are all these opportunities for the environment to interact with those genes. One of the most powerful times to interact would be prenatally, while the genes are really duplicating and reduplicating themselves to create the individual cells. There's a great opportunity for drugs or toxins or, deprived nutrition, stress, these kinds of things to alter those genes so that as the individual is developing in the womb, they actually are altering their own genes so that when they're born, they're not exactly a perfect representation of the gene mixture that was their mom and their dad. They've also got this influence of the environment, that prenatal environment. So when I was talking about identical twins versus fraternal twins, it's really important to think about the fact that, identical twins probably share a more similar environment and are more likely to both have been affected by prenatal influences like drugs and toxins and nutrition and stress than fraternal twins who are in their own amniotic sac and on their own placenta all the time, every time. So that's an important thing to keep in mind as far as, they differ in gene, degree of gene overlap, but they also differ in degree of, overlap of environment. I got this diagram off of a medical website, so they call it postnatal. I would say, infancy. So during the, infancy period, again, still the individual is growing a lot and really replicating a lot of their cells and things like that. So there's a bigger opportunity for things like neglect or abuse or variations in care to have an impact on the genetic profile. So again, the person who in birth to 2 years old are probably going to be more impacted by negative outcomes than people who are older. Now you'll notice on this list, everything that's on here is negative. It seems that at this point, the epigenetic theory is that your genes are sort of set up for, ideal conditions. And so if everything's good, you're going to just sort of manifest your genes. But it's in deprivation, at least, that we can see the effects. If the environment has something wrong, that's when we can see that the genes are altered. It may turn out that you can enhance genes too, but at this moment, their theory is just about, harming your genes. Then during the juvenile period, this would be, during, from about age 2 until full growth is complete. Social contact, environmental complexity, these kinds of things can have an impact on genes also. Nutrition absolutely is going to have an impact on genes, things like that. So when we talk about epigenetics, we're talking about how literally the genes can be altered as a result of experiences in the world. So that's the idea in this field. Now, what about evolutionary psychology? Okay, this field is based on attempting to explain how evolutionary principles can help explain the origin and function of the human mind, of traits, of behaviors. So in evolutionary psychology, they're going to try and look back and say, well, how did our ancestors live? How do people who currently today live in ways that are more similar to our ancestral history different from those who live in a more modern lifestyle? Like, can we attribute any differences that we see to the fact that the environments are different, right? Like maybe some people are living more like evolution designed them, and others are living in ways that are not necessarily representative of what evolution was designed for. And then we can see whether, that environment is playing a role. So there's a strong genetic component to evolutionary psychology, the assumption being that certain traits are passed on through genes. But then there's also this aspect of, like the lifestyle aspects. So a lot of you have taken, biology courses and other kinds of things. And certainly when you were in high school, hopefully they talked a little bit about evolution. But I think one of the things that is probably the most misunderstood about the theory of evolution is the concept of natural selection. So I thought I'd just review briefly how natural selection works. And when I say briefly, I've got the slowest, mowest reveal animation going on. I don't know why. So species genome. Okay, so this is what we're talking about when we talk about human DNA. We're not talking about your DNA. We're talking about human DNA. So when we look at, the overall what's in our species genome, we're not a really good way to distinguish behavior genetics from evolutionary psychology is to realize that behavior genetics is trying to explain individual differences, and evolutionary psychology is trying to explain species-wide commonalities. So if you think about it like that, it'll make a lot more sense. So in natural selection, the individuals that have certain traits that are advantageous for the environment are going to be healthier. They're going to survive longer. They're going to be more likely to have offspring. So conditions we call it a niche when we talk about evolutionary psychology. But in any niche, there are certain conditions that are favorable to some kinds of traits and conditions that are favorable to other traits. The individuals that have the advantageous traits are the ones who are most likely to survive into adulthood. And most importantly, they're the ones who are most likely to get their genes into the future. So when we talk about natural selection, the select is referring to getting your genes into the future. So, and this is happening naturally. This is different from artificial selection, which is what humans do when we breed dogs or other kinds of animals to get certain traits. We deliberately pair up this male and this female and have them breed with the hopes that certain traits will be descended into the offspring, whatever. That's artificial selection because us humans are doing it on purpose. Natural selection is where the environment, literally the environment is picking the traits that are desirable. Now, in our ancestral history, it would be like the physical environment, the access to certain kinds of foods or the temperatures or sun exposure or other kinds of things. Some individuals are better suited to some niches, and they're going to have more successful reproductive capabilities, is the idea here. And so since our goal in evolutionary psychology is to explain those outcomes that are ideally as universal as possible, they really are trying to explain species-wide characteristics. So since that's their goal, they're trying to find those cultural or physical environmental things that may lead to certain outcomes. This ability to reproduce. So how might evolution have shaped the human species? Well, let's talk about something very specific. In humans, between about 9 and 13 months old, babies start to display something called stranger anxiety. They really don't want to be around new people. They suddenly start, wanting to be held or be behind their moms, or they might actually cry when a new person wants to hold them or something, when previously they didn't care who held them. This kind of stranger anxiety is seen around the world. It's seen very specifically during this little narrow window, and it seems to be very impervious to whether you've been in daycare or, it doesn't really matter. A lot of people think they can get around some of these natural reactions that babies have by, well, I'll have them in daycare, and then they'll always be around strangers, and then they won't have this thing. They'll be fine with the people in the daycare, that's true, but when grandma and grandpa fly up from Florida to visit the kids are still going to freak out because this is a stranger. So it's just going to happen. So it's a natural, normal thing that is seen in children all around the world during this specific period. So let's use it as an example of what we're talking about with regard to evolutionary psychology. Imagine if you have a toddler, a 9 to 13-month-old is just learning to walk. Somewhere in this range is the very normal period for kids to start walking. So if you have one that doesn't have stranger anxiety and is just learning to walk, they may wander off. They may encounter danger. Their parents aren't there to help them. They may fall. They may get eaten if it's ancestral history. There's a lot of things that could happen to a toddler who is inappropriately bold, right? So these could end up being the offspring that never grow up to reproduce, right? They get selected out. Kids who display stranger anxiety are much more likely to stick close to their parents, and that means their parents can protect them and prevent the injuries or death that could prevent these children from growing into adulthood and joining the reproductive future. If you have too much of it on the other side, what I mean by that is well beyond 13 months. We're talking about 5-year-olds and things that are still displaying this kind of stranger anxiety. You can actually have a person who starts to develop into social anxiety, fear of being separated from their loved ones. This is a true psychological disorder. These people are also equally reduced in their likelihood of reproduction, because a lot of times, because of their fear of others, they never find a mate. And so they're selected out of the gene pool. So when we talk about evolutionary psychology, this is all they're trying to explain, is like how traits might be present in our species as a function of having been favored through reproduction. That's it. That's all they're talking about. So if you have a characteristic that starts to manifest itself in middle age, evolutionary psychologists really, aren't that interested in it, and don't have very good explanations for it, because those traits are not going to impact that individual's ability to reproduce. They're in middle age. They probably either already had any offspring that they're going to have, or were already selected out of the gene pool anyway. So for the evolutionary psychologists, we are interested in those species-wide behaviors that manifest themselves prior to reproductive age and that seem to have an impact on reproduction. All right, so this little game we're going to play that is the hopeless, it's like the worst game ever. These evolutionary psychologists are the worst. I didn't develop this, but you're going to try and play along. The best thing you can do is to just honestly, no one can see you. There's nobody to try and, look like you didn't say something kind of mean or something. Nobody's going to see it. Just try and answer the question as honestly as you can, and then I'll tell you what the evolutionary psychologists say about it. All right, so you're in a rowboat with your fraternal twins. One of the twins is a boy and one is a girl. So they're the same age, but different sexes. The boat turns over and all of you get flipped out of the boat, and you're the only one who can swim. You're too far from the shore. There is no way for your fraternal twins to swim by themselves. They do not know how to swim. The boat has sunk, it's gone, you can't hang on to it till you can get back. You can only save one. There's nothing else to say about it. There's nothing, no trick or anything you can say. That's not the point of this exercise. One of them you're going to save, and one of them is going to drown. Oh my gosh, I told you this was a horrible game. So who do you save? There's not any information here to help you. Sometimes my students will say whichever one's closest to me. So let me amend it and make it really clear to you that they are equidistant. it's not the case that one of them's closer to the shore. You guys are like all three parallel to the shore. One is this far away from you to your right, and one of them is this far, same amount far away from you to your left, and the shore is in front of you. So you've got to swim to one of them and take them to shore. I told you this was an awful game. All right, who are you going to save? All right. Now let's imagine you're back in that stupid rowboat because apparently you're slow to learn your lessons. This time you're out with two boys. One of them is a 5-year-old and one of them is a 1-year-old. The same exact thing happens. The boat flips, you're equidistant from the two of them. You can only save one. No, you don't have life jackets. So, who are you going to save? The 5-year-old or the 1-year-old? All right. Well, you know what? Let me give you the answers to those two before we go to the cute little baby on its tummy. All right, so what evolutionary psychology says is that you would save the boy because he represents a greater chance of getting your genes into the future because boys can have, over their lifetime, more babies than girls can. That's their explanation. So if you were leaning boy and you don't know why, the evolutionary psychologist would say this is the explanation for why. They represent more of your potential grandchildren. Now, when you're with the two boys and they're different, the difference here is age. A lot of people say, well, I'd save the 1-year-old, the 5-year-old at least got to live. But no, the evolutionary psychologist says you would save the 5-year-old. And sometimes my students will say, well, I'd save the 5-year-old because I know them better, which is an interesting concept. But so what the evolutionary psychologists say is that you would select the 5-year-old because the 5-year-old has already survived the dangerous infancy period. The most risky time to be alive is between birth and 2 years of age. So the 5-year-old has already made it through that risky time and is a better bet. They're more likely to get your genes in the future. They are more likely to make it to adulthood, find a mate, and make you some grandchildren and get your genes into the future. So as you can see from the evolutionary theory, really the whole goal is just to get your genes into the future. So it comes out where you're making decisions that you might have a rational justification for why you do them, but they always come back to, but underlying that is this reproductive thing. All right, so now we have this cute little baby on their tummy, which is it's deliberate so that you can't tell what the sex of the baby is. All right, so we've got a newborn baby. Who is more ecstatic at the birth of this newborn baby? The mom's parents or the dad's parents? All right, hopefully you have picked one. The evolutionary psychologists say that it will be the mom's parents. And the reason for that is that the babies that come out of their daughters are clearly their grandchildren, right? There's no question who the parent is for those grandparents. They know that their offspring is the parent of that child. For the dad's parents, there's a little hint of doubt. We think it is our grandchild, but it's, possible that it's somebody else's baby. So they're more guarded with their son's offspring as far as that ecstaticness, according to the evolutionary psychologist. Now, in case you think that's really harsh, they did a study in Oregon a couple of decades ago now where they DNA swabbed all the parents who were coming in to have babies at this hospital. And they were all, parents who were supposed to be the biological parents, the mom and the dad. They come in, yes, this is my child. And they found that 10% of those babies were not the fathers. So it's not crazy to be a little guarded and think, I'm pretty sure this is my grandchild, but it's possible it's not when as the parent, I'm the parent of the son. I'm the parent of the dad. Confusing phrasing. The dad's parents might be a little guarded about it, and they might not even know or think about it like that. But there may be just more investment from the mom's parents because they know for sure this is their offspring, and less investment from the dad's parents because a lot of times they'll say it's because the their daughter-in-law or the mother of the child doesn't want their interference that much. But there's maybe an evolutionary explanation. So evolutionary psychology has spent a lot of time talking about sex differences in especially mate selection and mating behaviors. On average, men tend to seek to reproduce widely, is how evolutionary psychologists phrase it, and women seek to reproduce wisely. What they're saying there is that because men have more reproductive capability, that is, they make new sperm all the time. They deposit millions of them at every ejaculation. Sperm are not very valuable, right? You can always make more. For women, there is 1 egg per month. That's it. 1 egg per month, 12 eggs a year. I guess it might work out to some years you get 13 eggs in a year. That's it. Maybe if you're taking certain hormones or if you have a biological predisposition, you might release 2 eggs in a cycle. So maybe just being, wild, I might say, okay, maybe 26 eggs in a year. Whereas for a male, it's trillions of sperm in a year. So for the evolutionary psychologist, that makes sperm a lot less valuable than eggs, even to their owners, right? The female realizes any individual egg is going to produce potentially an offspring that's going to take 9 months of pregnancy, 18 years of raising. Like every egg represents a potential, very long-term, very physically demanding, very, commitment potentially. And for a male, every sperm represents a chance, but nothing like what an egg represents. So men are prone to have this perspective of wanting to reproduce widely, that is, have sex with multiple partners, other kinds of things, whereas women are more likely to want to reproduce wisely. So when we look at it psychologically, we see from surveys that men think about sex more, they masturbate more, and they desire a greater number of sexual partners than women tend to do. Men are more aggressive towards other men when they are thinking about dating and mating. Now, this is I love the way that social psychologists have come up with ways of measuring aggressiveness. So when they put men into a mindset about thinking about dating or thinking about, having, a sexual relationship or something like that, and then they pair the man up with what they think is another man to play a game. Supposedly they're each in their own little room playing on the computer, some kind of competitive game where, the one with the fastest reaction time gets to punish the other one with a blast of white noise that's just, static in their earphones. Or maybe they get to pour out some Tabasco juice and send it over to the other lab and make them drink it or something like that. There really is no other person in the other room. But the person who's playing doesn't know that because he keeps getting his ears blasted with white noise whenever he loses, or he has to drink Tabasco whenever he loses. So he assumes what he's sending over is being received by another person. And so what they find is that when men have been primed to think about dating or to think about mating, they are meaner to another man. They will crank up the volume on the white noise. They will give him a bigger dose of Tabasco sauce. So we see these kinds of things in men. In women, they tend to look for signs of maturity, boldness, and support for her in potential mates. And I don't mean necessarily financial support when it says support for her. Support like dedication, loyalty, fidelity, things like that. And then when women are ovulating, unbeknownst to them, they behave differently. Like they would say that they don't, but numerous studies over the past 25 years have shown that women who are ovulating, and sometimes women don't know they're even ovulating, so this has got to be subconscious, right? They don't even know that they're ovulating, yet they have gone out to go dancing with their friends and they're actually wearing more revealing clothes than they did 2 nights ago when they were out dancing with their friends. Or they dance more provocatively than they did 2 nights ago when they weren't ovulating and they were out with their friends. Women's voices actually change during ovulation. They get a little bit more feminine sounding. There's just some really interesting changes that occur around ovulation. So both sexes have changes in their behavior when surrounding times or situations that involve dating and mating. But generally the idea is that because each potential offspring represents a ginormous commitment for a woman, and each potential offspring represents maybe a commitment for a man, it produces different behaviors in the sexes on average. All right, so there are some criticisms of the evolutionary psychology perspective. One is that it's completely hindsight biased logic, right? They're seeing modern behaviors today, and then they're looking into the past to try and come up with explanations for why a person's acting like that. So they start with a finding, and then they work backwards to try and construct an explanation for it. You know, I would like to point out, just like your textbook does, that's true for all theories, right? I mean, if you want to just flip this and say, okay, well, let's try and explain it through cultural mechanisms, why men might behave differently or value different things, stuff like that. We ultimately end up with, well, because culture socializes them to behave like that. Well, why would a culture preserve behaviors that are like that? Like, what's the advantage to the culture to do that, right? So now we're back doing this backwards kind of hindsight biased logic. It's the same basic problem, whether your explanation is that it was naturally selected through evolutionary principles, or it's what the culture wants you to do. Either way, you're trying to explain today's behaviors through things that might have happened in the past. Another criticism of evolutionary psychology is that it seems to give justification for harmful behavior. Evolutionary psychologists use it, evolutionary psychology is often used to explain why men are aggressive or why men are promiscuous. And so some people think it's just an opportunity for an excuse for behaving in ways that are not culturally desirable, but are, people will go, well, you know what, I can't help it, it's my natural behavior. These criticisms are valid for all theoretical situations and stuff, but I would like to really emphasize this last part, this justification for harmful behavior. Just like I said with the blisters, right? You have a predisposition to make a blister, but you can choose to do stuff to avoid blisters. You can put on gloves before you use a shovel. You can put, a Band-Aid or moleskin on your heel before you go for a hike in new boots. There are things you can do to avoid those behaviors. And so just because natural selection favors certain behaviors, that doesn't mean that a human who has all this cognitive capacity has to act in those ways. So these explanations should not be viewed as excuses. They should be viewed as explanations. And then anyone who's listening to this should be thinking to themselves, well, this is a good roadmap for how to not act in these harmful ways, right? So that's the thing I would really like to emphasize about evolutionary psychology, is that yes, you may have predispositions, but you ultimately have the choice in how to act. All right, let's go ahead and take a break here, and we'll come back and talk some more about culture.